Hey guys, and welcome back to Bedtime Crime. Today we are continuing in our family series, so we have another family involved case today, and when I tell you this one's a doozy, this one, buckle up, go grab yourself a snack, you're gonna need it. This is quite the tale I'm about to tell you. So, as you can tell by the title, today's video is about the infamous serial killer couple, Fred and Rosemary West. So this case actually takes place across the pond in the UK, and this is one of the most notorious cases in the UK. Like, everybody in the UK knows about it, and I think a lot of people in America know about it too. Even though it is kind of like on the older side, it's still just such a crazy story, honestly. So with that being said, I do feel the need to put a slight disclaimer. I feel like I'm doing that in all my videos. You guys kind of get it by now. This is a true crime channel. We're going to be talking about some pretty gruesome stuff. However, this one I do feel like I need to especially put a trigger warning on, because the people that I'm talking about today, Fred and Rosemary, did just unspeakable, unfathomable things. And it was hard for me to wrap my head around what they did, and it'll be hard for you to wrap your head around what they did. So go in putting your mental health first, and if gruesome or twisted cases or overly graphic cases make you feel some type of way, then please don't continue watching. However, I am really excited to hear you guys' thoughts about this case and your thoughts about Fred and Rose, so I think we're just gonna jump right in because we have a lot to get through. So Fred West was born on September 29th, 1941 in Muchmarcle, Herefordshire, and he was born into a family of farmers and was the second of 6 children to Daisy and Walter West. Now, although there is no excuse for what he would go on to do later in life, Fred's young life and upbringing was anything but normal. He was consistently physically and sexually assaulted, and his house was actually extremely dirty, the house that he was raised in. And since they were farmers, when they had to kill the chickens or pigs, they would actually usually just do it right on the kitchen table where they would eat later. So they would literally kill animals on a table where they were going to eat later. And Fred's upbringing was described as almost a feral experience, and almost every day he had some kind of contact with death, since he was often in charge of killing the animals on the farm once he got a little bit older. And it is said that his mother, Daisy, was definitely took on the matriarch role in their family. She definitely made the rules. She was dominant, very dominant. She was actually known by the children in their family to wear a really thick leather belt, and she was not afraid to use it on her children if she felt like they were acting up. And his father was unfortunately no better. He was also extremely violent in his own right, and it was actually speculated for a while that he might have even been a murderer himself just because of the way he acted. And this might have led to what happens later with Fred. And this isn't a baseless claim either. Walter actually had a first wife before he married Daisy, and this first wife was about 22 years older than him, and she died just 2 years after getting married to Walter from an alleged bee sting, which, I don't know about you, but I've never heard of anybody dying of a bee sting, and she wasn't allergic or anything, so. But Fred would also have to watch Walter literally sexually assault girls out in the farm fields, just casually, like it wasn't a big deal, like it was just part of his day, basically. And he explained this to Fred, because Fred was obviously there and saw this behavior. And he explained it to Fred as, if there's something that you want in life, you need to take it. And you'd be crazy to pass up on any opportunities, no matter what it cost you. In addition to all of this, his father also showed him weird things with, I don't know how to say, weird sexual things involving animals and just weird things, aggressive, violent, sexual things. His father would teach him all about this, and so Fred had a very skewed view of what sex is going to look like when you get older. And his mother was no better, of course, in terms of sexual things, because when he was first going through puberty at the age of only 13, he actually lost his virginity to his mother, which is super twisted. And I hate phrasing it like that because it's not really losing your virginity. That's a bad way to phrase it. His mother sexually assaulted him because he was not old enough to consent or even really know what was happening, because obviously your parents are the people that you're supposed to trust more than anyone. And a few years later, obviously these behaviors led to some of his behaviors, because he actually went to court for attempting to sexually assault his sister, and it turns out that Daisy, his mother, was actually encouraging him to do this to his sister. The idea hadn't just popped into his head when he saw his sister. His mother was actually feeding him these ideas that he should do these things. And Fred had no other basis to go off of. I mean, these were his parents. These were the people that raised him. Of course he would, if you're raised seeing something, you think that thing is right. He truly thought all of this was completely normal and that this is how everybody lived. Now, when Fred was 17 years old, he actually suffered brain damage due to a motorcycle accident. And it is said that he did change in personality and actions after this accident. They said that all of a sudden he would have no holds, no filter. He would just kind of do whatever he wanted and would take more of an interest in violent and gruesome things following this accident. So there's something to be said about that. Now let's get into Rose. So Rosemary Pauline Letts was born on November 29th, 1953. In Northam, which is a small town in northwest England, to her parents William, or Bill, as I'll refer to him as because that was his nickname, and Daisy Letts. Now, Bill was schizophrenic and would often be very paranoid and have very violent and aggressive mood swings and outbursts. And because of all this violence, Daisy, Rose's mother, also ended up falling into a pretty deep depression. And this is important because while she was pregnant with Rose, which was her 5th child, she was actually sent to a psychiatric hospital because of her depression, and she was actually given many rounds of electroconvulsive therapy, which is where they send the shocks through your body to try and rewire your brain so that you're not depressed or anxious or any kind of mental ailment like that. And they actually did this to her while she was pregnant with Rose. And the amount of electricity that they shocked her with actually would not be acceptable today by any means. It would be considered way too dangerous to give to somebody. And experts say that the amount of electricity that she was given, especially being pregnant, would certainly affect the growing fetus that she had inside of her, Rose. And after Rose was born, Daisy ended up basically completely withdrawing from the marriage, and that left Rose with Bill most of the time to raise her. And this is where some terrifying and disgusting similarities between Rose and Fred start, because this is when Rose started being sexually assaulted by Bill, her father. And this just developed a very wrong thought in Rose's brain from a young age that if you want something, you can get it with sex, essentially. Because that's all she had to do in order to get her father to give her something. And what's even more kind of twisted is that it almost made her feel sort of special in a way, because she was the 5th child and they had other daughters, but she was the one that her father kind of chose to sexually assault. And even though it's really wrong, this kind of made her feel loved in a way, and that was the way that she felt loved. And since her mom had basically completely withdrawn from the family, she really had no mother figure growing up. And Rose ended up never really feeling like her emotional needs were being met. That is something that children typically get from their mother, is more of the emotional side. And since she didn't have a mother, she never really felt like anybody necessarily cared about her beyond her body or what she could offer them. She never felt heard or seen or necessarily wanted for anything other than her body. And because of this, she always was looking for a partner or a man that she could connect to in that way that she would feel like met her emotional needs, essentially. Now let's jump back to Fred in his adult life. So Fred has been described by articles, friends, many people as the epitome of evil. And once you hear his crimes and the things that he did, I don't think you will disagree with that statement. At the age of 20, he had already been known as sort of a petty criminal in a way. He was arrested for incest after he got his 13-year-old sister pregnant, and his mother didn't stop defending him into his adult life and actually spoke at the trial for his sister on behalf of Fred. So she defended Fred and threw his sister under the bus, even though that was also her daughter. And he didn't end up getting in trouble for this, really, because the charges were dropped after the sister refused to testify against him, which I don't really blame her. I mean, if your own mother is defending your abuser, why, that would be really disheartening. So in 1962, Fred actually ended up getting married to his first wife. So Rose was not his first wife, and her name was Catherine Costello, and he actually met her because she was a prostitute, and he was one of her clients at first. So Catherine was born in Scotland, and they had actually gotten married when she was pregnant with somebody else's child, not Fred's. So she ended up giving birth in 1963, and she named the baby girl Charmaine. And Catherine was known for having a very strong personality, and a lot of people said that she matched Fred's energy really well. And she was described by friends and family as a very tough and manipulative woman. And while Fred was married to Catherine, they actually ended up hiring a nanny to help with childcare. So they hired 18-year-old Anne McFall. Now, Anne was actually also born in Scotland, and after graduating high school, she worked in a knitwear factory in Glasgow. And in 1966, she moved in with some friends around the Gloucester area, which is the area in which Catherine and Fred lived. Now, according to people who knew Fred at this time that they ended up hiring Anne McFall, he said that Anne would flirt with him all of the time while she was there, and, she seemed to really like him. And this is according to Fred. This is not confirmed in any way. And since she ended up becoming a live-in nanny, she lived in the caravan that Fred and Catherine lived in, obviously. And when Catherine would be away on some kind of work trip overnight, or, she just wasn't at the house that night, one of these nights, Fred and Anne actually began to have an affair. And this was not the only affair that Fred had by any means, as he had a string of other women that he would be with besides his wife. But what made Anne a little different is that she actually became pregnant with Fred's child in early 1967. However, soon after Catherine got back from her work trip, Fred couldn't exactly keep it a secret that him and Anne were having an affair if she was pregnant, and she would probably tell Catherine that it was his child. So, mysteriously, Anne ended up disappearing in May of 1967, and she was never seen again. So, a year after Charmaine was born, Catherine and Fred ended up having a child of their own, and they named her Anne Marie. Now, in 1969, Catherine and Fred actually ended up getting divorced, and Catherine was the one to leave, and she cited violence and sexual abuse at the hands of Fred for the reason that she was leaving. And for some reason, her friends and family ended up not being able to contact her again after 1971, which is when she went missing, and then suddenly nobody could get a hold of her anymore. Now, I think this is an important point to mention, since we're here in the timeline, that Fred was not in any way scary to just, the average person. And he didn't really give off bad vibes to just the average person who knew him. He seemed friendly enough, he was charismatic. And this is very similar to other serial killers, famous serial killers that we've heard of that got away with their crimes for so long. Such as like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer. They were very charismatic, and so was Fred. And he was funny, he was nice, he was charming, especially to the women. And these women really, really gravitated towards him. He didn't give off bad vibes in any way, which sometimes can lead to the most dangerous of killers. Now let's jump back again to Rose's adult life and how that's going. So Rose was in no way on the straight and narrow. She was on just as bad of a path as Fred was at this time, and she actually ended up becoming a prostitute. And after talking about both of their pasts, now that we're in both of their adult lives, I do think it's important to point out that neither one of these people had any sense of what was right and wrong. Their childhoods were completely dysfunctional and disturbing, and they were never checked on for anything that they did. And after the progression of violence that they were going throughout their lives, to them it seemed completely normal to then move into more heinous crimes. It would have made sense for them in their minds to only progress in the crimes that they were doing because they didn't see anything wrong with what they were doing. It does not excuse anything they did, but it is a reason. So that brings us to Fred and Rose meeting. So they met when Rose was only 15 years old in 1968. And Fred was 12 years older than her, so at this time he was already 27, and he was interested in a 15-year-old. Now, Rose's father, Bill, initially disapproved of the relationship and tried to report Fred since his daughter was underage by a lot. However, he ended up not reporting him and taking back his claims because he ended up really liking Fred and saying that Fred was a man in his own image, which is not exactly a good thing from what you heard about Rose's dad. So after Rose and Fred were dating for a little while, Rose ended up moving in with Fred, but her father would still regularly come over to their house and sleep with Rose. And essentially, he became one of her clients, which is so weird. Also at this time, Rose became a stepmother, if you could call her that, to Charmaine and Anne-Marie. It is said that Charmaine, who was 8 at this time, when they got married, was a very rebellious young girl, and she often made it very known how much she just absolutely despised Rose. And while Rose was living with Fred, Charmaine, and Anne-Marie, Fred actually ended up being arrested and sent to jail for theft of cars. And during this time that Fred was in jail for the theft of cars charge, it's unknown how, but we do know that Rose decided to end Charmaine's life. She was tired of Charmaine saying she hated her all the time, she was tired of her attitude, and she thought it would just be easier if Charmaine was out of the picture entirely. So when Fred got out of prison, a normal person's reaction would be horror, devastation, any normal reaction. But Fred was not upset about this at all. In fact, he didn't care. He said, she's not my daughter, technically. She was, this other girl's daughter, so that's fine. And he actually ended up just burying Charmaine beneath the kitchen window at their home at the time on Midland Road in Gloucester. So after that, they ended up getting married in 1971, soon after Fred had gotten out of prison when Rose was officially legal, 18 years old. And the couple ended up relocating to a new house on 25 Cromwell Street, which is now known as the place where most of the horrors of the West family happened. And they actually would have a lot of people come in and out of their place at 25 Cromwell Street. They essentially acted almost as landlords for the property, where people would rent out rooms from them, and they would just collect rent every month from the people that were renting out their rooms. Which brings us to talking about Shirley Ann Robinson. So Shirley Ann Robinson was born in Leicestershire and would go on to live in Germany and the West Midlands. So she briefly lived with Fred and Rose, and ended up actually having an affair with Fred, surprise, surprise. And she actually really loved Fred. It wasn't just about, sleeping with him or anything like that. And she actually started to kind of see herself as Rose's replacement. I think she was under the impression that Fred would eventually leave Rose for her because she was under the impression that they both loved each other. However, Rose, got news about this and didn't really like that Shirley was saying that she was in love with Fred and that she was her replacement. So Rose told Fred that Shirley had to go. And during the course of their affair, Shirley actually wound up pregnant with Fred's baby. And Rose obviously did not want her to have Fred's baby because that's a bad look. And after this, when she was 8 months pregnant, she was last seen in May 1978, and she was only 18 years old at this time. Now, Fred and Rose did end up having children together. Now, remember, they still have Anne-Marie from his previous marriage with Catherine, but they did end up having more children together. Rose never really took to the whole mother thing very well. She really would lay into Anne-Marie and always got on her about taking care of the younger kids since she was the oldest. Even though they were her kids, she basically made Anne-Marie take on sort of a parent role. And their first child that they ended up having together was a daughter named Heather, who was born on October 17th, 1970 in Gloucester. And growing up, Heather was described as rebellious and difficult. And she was not afraid to tell her father how she felt about the things that he was doing within the family, to others, just the sick things that he was doing. She was not afraid to call him out on that. And at one point, it is believed that she went to her father and told him that she was going to go to the police with all the things that he had done, and also the things that he was doing to her, which we will get into. And soon after this threat was made, she ended up going missing at only 16 years old. Her parents never reported her missing, which is not surprising. And they usually had some kind of excuse as to where she was, so people didn't get too suspicious about it. And also consistently throughout their lives at 25 Cromwell Street that we talked about, Rose had this light that would light up whenever someone rang the doorbell, and it was a red light. And this would alert her when there was a new customer at the door. And these customers were obviously for her job, her prostitution business. And she actually had her own private room in the house that wasn't like her bedroom or anything. It was just her own private room where she would run this business out of. And this was all while her kids were in the house, and Fred was often home in the house too. And Fred did not care at all that Rose was doing this. Like, it's not like he had a problem with this. Instead, when she had clients over, the children were told that they had to be quiet and that they weren't allowed to go into the room that Rose was in because mom had friends in there. In addition to telling his kids that they had to be, quiet and that they couldn't go in the room, he also would go around the neighborhood or town basically advertising Rose and saying that men could sleep with Rose if they paid the right price, and he almost acted as like a pimp for her, essentially. And the even weirder part of this is that Fred got some sort of weird satisfaction or high from watching his wife sleep with other men, or sometimes women, and he would actually drill holes through the wall that was connected to the room, and he would just watch as she was sleeping with these other people. Now, throughout the course of their adult lives, Rose would actually end up having 3 more children from men who were not Fred. And they never really could be narrowed down to who the father was, since she did have a lot of clients and she didn't really keep track of who was coming in and out. So it's really unknown as to who these children belonged to, essentially. And something else that was super traumatizing for their children, as if this entire life hasn't been traumatizing enough for them, Fred said that he would break his daughters in. And I think we can all guess what that means, since he chose to do this at around puberty age, such as 13 for the girls. And sometimes people renting from them would actually hear like screams or yelling from some of the daughters for their dad to stop, which is just awful. And he also ended up pushing his first daughter that he had with Catherine into prostitution, just like Rose. So when her siblings thought that she was just doing normal, like, teenage things and she was just out with her friends, she was actually going out to find clients and essentially make money. Like I said, Fred almost acted like a pimp, not only for his wife, but then for his oldest daughter. And the whole house was just a terrible environment for these poor kids to grow up in. And people that were coming in and out, whether it be Rose's clients or the people that they were renting to, would often just walk around naked. So the children were exposed to, nudity, adult nudity, pretty often. They also would play they would just have like porn playing on the TVs while the children were there. And it was around this time as the children were growing up that Rose and Fred would actually start to have similar fantasies about assault and torture, to be honest, that they could enact together. So Fred decided to take this a step further than just a fantasy, and he ended up soundproofing the cellar. And he essentially wanted to turn it into kind of like a bondage chamber where they could bring victims that they found. So that brings us to where we get into the more heinous and I guess kind of random crimes and their killing spree essentially that they decided to commit. So let's get into them. Linda Gow was their next victim, and she was only 19 when she went missing. She was living in Gloucester at the time with her family, and she was actually working as a seamstress. And in April of 1973, when she didn't come back home after her shift, she was officially reported missing by her parents. Carol Ann Cooper was next. She was born in Luton, Bedfordshire, and she moved to Worcester when she was older. And her nickname was actually Kaz, and she was staying at the Pine Children's Home at this time. And she was actually given permission by this home to spend the weekend with her grandmother. And on the 10th of November, she boarded a bus to get to her grandmother's house to spend the weekend with her, and she was never seen again after that. Next was Lucy Partington, who was born in St. Albans, and she grew up in Bishop's Cleeve. She was described as clever and well-liked. She was attending Exeter University when she decided to return home for Christmas on the 20th of December, 1973. So 2 days later, she ended up leaving her friend's house, and after that, she was never seen again. Next was Therese Siegenthaler, who was born in Switzerland and was only 21 at the time that she went missing. And she was attending a London college pursuing a degree in secretarial studies. And during her weekends, she would actually work in a ballet shoe factory. And this ballet shop was actually located in the Swiss Center in Leicestershire Square. And she was a petite woman with blondish hair. And during Easter time in 1974, Therese went to hitchhike just to visit her friend in Ireland. It was a common thing she did. And she unfortunately never made it to Ireland to visit her friend and never returned home. Their next victim was Shirley Hubbard, who was only 15 years old, making her the youngest of their crime spree, not related by blood. And she was described as pretty, spirited, but vulnerable. Shirley was born in Birmingham, and she attended Droitwich High School. She also did have a job, even at 15, at a place called Debenhams, and on November 14th, 1971, she left to go for her shift at work, but she was never seen again after that. All right, so next is Juanita Mott, and I know that these are a lot of victims and a lot to get through and take in, but it's important to emphasize how many victims they had and how horrible of people they were, essentially, just to find these random girls. And I do truly wish I had more information to offer about each of these victims, who they were, their lives before, because I always try to advocate that victims are so much more than the way their lives end. They're all people, but we truly don't know what the extent of what these girls went through or, much about their early lives, and we probably never will, unfortunately. So, Juanita Mott was born in 1957, and she was described as rebellious, difficult, strong-willed, and outgoing. So when she was 18 years old in April 1975, she left her house to go to a friend's wedding, which was happening in Gloucester. However, she never ended up making it to the wedding and was never seen again. So the last unrelated victim is Allison Chambers, and she was also known as her nickname Allie. So Allie was born in Hanover, West Germany. She was a rebellious teenager and went on to live with her friend in Gloucester when she was only 16 years old. And shortly before her 17th birthday in August 1979, she mysteriously disappeared and was never seen again. The saddest part about all of these victims is that we know that they were most likely tortured during their final days. Nobody's completely sure about what happened in that cellar or to these victims. but we do know that some unspeakable and horrific things happened to result in their deaths. And just based off of the way that they had soundproofed the cellar and made this entire like chamber of torture essentially, we can only imagine what happens to these poor girls. So finally, investigators started to become a little suspicious of what was going on in the West home after there were child abuse allegations against them in August of 1992, which left their 5 remaining children that were living with them to be taken into protective care. And during their time in protective care, the investigators saw a lot of red flags, but one of the biggest ones is that the children would often make jokes about their older sister, presumably Heather, being buried under the patio. And in the summer of 1993, investigators were made aware of these jokes, and they took them very seriously because that's not something that kids would think of on their own to joke about. And we did find out later that Fred had threatened his other children that he would do the same things to them that he did to Heather if they ever said anything about what happened. So they were actually able to obtain a search warrant for the house, and they genuinely could not have predicted the absolute horrific scene that they were about to uncover. So the first body that they ended up finding when they looked under the home was that of Heather West, who was unfortunately killed back in 1987 when she initially went missing. In addition to that, they also ended up finding Anne McFall, who we talked about earlier, as the woman who he was having an affair with his first wife when she was pregnant. They found her remains as well as those of her unborn baby in a field at Kempley, which was near Fred's house. Also in the field at Kempley, very close to Anne McFall, they ended up finding Catherine's remains as well. Linda Gow, who we talked about earlier, which was one of the first of their heinous crime spree, her remains were found in what was a former car inspection pit in a garage that was later turned into a bathroom at 25 Cromwell. Carol Ann Cooper was found buried in the cellar of 25 Cromwell. Investigators concluded that she had most likely been kidnapped by Fred when she was hitchhiking, and then who knows what happened after that. So Lucy, Juanita, Allie, and Teresa's remains were also found at 25 Cromwell, and Shirley and her unborn baby remains were also found in the garden area of 25 Cromwell. And when these remains were found, it was very clear to investigators that most, if not all, of these victims were either tortured, assaulted, or in some other way almost punished in a way. So obviously after finding all this, the police have more than enough to arrest Fred and Rose. What's interesting though is that Fred pretty readily admitted to all of this and even helped investigators locate some of the final remains that they hadn't found yet. So they were arrested on February 25th, 1984. Fred was 52 at this time of being arrested. And on the 27th of February, so 2 days later, Rose was actually able to make bail. However, Fred did end up remaining in jail during this time. And the next day, the 28th, Fred made his first court appearance, and at this time he was actually only being charged with Heather's murder, and they hadn't fully discovered and identified the other bodies of the victims yet. And on the 14th of March, as many more bodies were being found and recovered, and Rose was obviously being accused as Fred's accomplice, she denied any involvement in any of the crimes involving these bodies, and she was only able to keep up this facade for so long because on April 20th, she was rearrested for her involvement in the murders, and on June 30th, Rose and Fred ended up appearing in court together to face their charges, and Fred ended up being charged with 12 counts of murder, and Rose was jointly charged with 10 counts. Now, during the trial, Fred seems to be very happy with Rose, trying to catch her eye or wave to her, and she basically just shunned and ignored him and acted like she wanted nothing to do with him. She didn't pay attention to him at all. And I think this really affected Fred's mental health because he thought that Rose was the love of his life and that they were a team and that they did all this together and they would stay together. But then she was kind of just ignoring him. He would also send her letters in jail and she would just never respond. And while all this is happening, a lot of changes were being made to Fred's defense team. He started with attorney Howard Ogden and then would go through more than 4 changes to his team, with him firing and rehiring people, and certain people would just take themselves off the case. And this would actually all prove pointless at the end of the day, because on January 1st, 1995, Fred West was found dead in his prison cell at age 53, and it was revealed that he had taken his own life. Rose, however, ended up making it to trial, and in November 1995, she was convicted on all 10 counts of murder, and she will spend the rest of her life in prison. And Rose, actually, what's interesting is to this day, she's never wavered in her innocence, which makes things a little difficult for people to get closure or feel like things are solved, because she refuses to accept responsibility, and she won't answer any questions because she says that she didn't do it. And they ended up actually destroying the house on 25 Cromwell Street because of all the horrific things that had happened there. And it's now actually a remembrance garden for all of the victims of their crime spree, and it's actually a really beautiful place where people can just go and pay their respects. So to this day, investigators in the UK still believe that they haven't found all of the victims of Fred and Rose's, but since Fred took his own life and Rose still claims that she had nothing to do with it, they really have no way of getting more answers about all of the things that actually happened at 25 Cromwell Street. And unfortunately, they probably never will. And that leads us to where we are today. So Rose is still in prison, as she will be for the rest of her life. And then obviously the rest of their children were put into other homes, which are probably infinitely better than the homes that they were put in. Unfortunately, Heather and Charmaine never got that chance, which is just super sad. But at least there's a little bit of a happy ending for their remaining children, but it was just so senseless what they did. There was no point in doing what they did. There was no motive, really, except for the fact that they wanted to cause pain, essentially. But let me know what you guys think of this case. I'm pretty sure I can already guess what most of you would think of this case, but just let me know if you have any hot takes or anything like that. And please give this video a thumbs up if you liked hearing me talk about it, and consider subscribing to my channel. It really helps me out a lot. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye, guys.